Hello, class. I found one of the things that students find most difficult when beginning any class, or really within biblical and theological subjects, is writing a paper. And so what I want to do is I want to walk you through kind of what I'm looking for in how you are to write a paper. And so what I find is a lot of students, they've got really good ideas and they've got really good content in their papers, but even when they have good ideas or good contents, they aren't able to put together a solid paper. Because they aren't able to structure and organize their thoughts well, or to be able to use resources well. And so we're going to talk about that as we go through this slideshow. So on the first slide, we're going to be talking about how to write an introduction and a thesis. The introduction should give a brief introduction of the topic, and it should be on topic. This is important. The introduction is you introducing the topic to your professor. When you do that, you're introducing what you're going to be writing about in the paper. A lot of people, and in fact the majority of papers that I have ever read, what the topic or the introduction is really generally doing within student papers is they're introducing themselves, or why they chose to write about this topic, or why they like this topic. That's not a good introduction. The topic or the introduction should not be about yourself. It should be about the content matter. So if you're writing a paper on the topic of covenant, introduce the theme covenant. If you're writing a paper on Abraham, introduce Abraham. Don't talk about why you like Abraham or what Abraham has meant to you. Talk about Abraham. So an introduction for a shorter paper, so a paper somewhere between 750, 1,500 words, should be about 3 to 5 sentences. And then it should just gradually kind of increase the longer the paper is. Obviously, if you're writing a book or a dissertation, your introduction is going to be an entire chapter. But with the short papers like you will encounter in this class, or the shorter papers that you'll encounter in this class, you should just have a short introduction. At the end of your introduction, you should have your thesis statement. The thesis should detail what you are going to argue. In a more advanced paper, it will also say how you are going to argue it. I am fine with saying this paper will, and then you tell me what you're going to do and what you're going to argue in your paper. Don't use first person. Don't say I will be arguing my point of view. Don't use I, me, my, we, us, our. Use just like standard language like this paper will. The thesis statement can be more than one sentence, but should always be to the point. One thing that I see that students struggle with continually is they write thesis statements that comprise the entire introductory paragraph. That should not be the case. Your thesis statement should come at the end of your introduction, and it should be what your paper is going to be about. If your entire introduction is what your thesis is, there are two things that are wrong with that. One, you didn't introduce the topic, and then two, your thesis statement is much too long. Right, on the next slide, we see that the structure and argument is an important aspect of the paper. Your paper should always have a strong flow of thought and should move seamlessly from one point to the next. I know that seems like a logical statement, but I read very few papers that do this. Your argument should follow your thesis statement in the order that you present your thesis. So if your paper said something along the lines of, this paper will argue A, B, and C, it will do this by, and you discuss some of the things that you're going to do very quickly. The first thing, the first paragraph in the body of your paper should be an argument about A, that first thing that you mentioned in the thesis statement. Then you should finish, you should talk about that. You should finish what you're talking about with A. Then you should move on to B. You should talk about B in exclusion to all of the others. Then you should finish it and then talk about C, right? So you're going to move from one point to the next point following the order that you gave in your thesis statement. Almost no papers that I read from students at any level do this. In fact, what I see most often is somebody will say this paper will argue A, B, and C. It will do this by yada, yada, yada. And then I see them write about C first because it's the last thing they mentioned in their thesis. Well, you're not following your thesis statement if you do that. You're going completely out of order. And you also shouldn't be talking about multiple concepts at once. Now, that's not to say that when you're talking about A and then you get to B, you can make statements along the lines of the points made in A where like some of the points that you made in A, you can still address in topic B as you're doing it to try to prove further topic B, but you're focused on topic B. Many professors, myself included, prefer the use of headings and subheadings in papers. This helps you stay on topic. It helps me understand what topic you're supposed to use. This will also help you stay focused. So for shorter papers, just use headings. So if your paper is no longer than 2,000 words, you should really only use headings. But if it gets longer than 2,000 words, it might be good to use subheadings as well. Please see the style guide that's provided by the university for that. You have to have more than one subheading if you have subheadings under a heading, though. So you can't. It's kind of like when you're doing outlines. You can't just have point 1 and not have no point 2. You always have to have a point 1 and a point 2. Make sure that the first sentence in each section and each paragraph clearly mentions the topics of the section and paragraph. So this is called a topic sentence. Topic sentences are very important. A topic sentence is going to orient everything you're going to say in the rest of the paragraph. What I see students often do is they'll make some random statement at the beginning of a paragraph, and it really kind of sets the reader off on an understanding or on a wrong understanding of what's going to be argued throughout the paper. So what you really need to do is you need to make sure that the first sentence in each section and in each paragraph clearly addresses the points that you're going to make in that paragraph. So an example of this would be something along the lines of, let's say that you're writing a paper on the book of Judges and you're going to be talking about some of the main themes in the book of Judges. That's your thesis statement is about the main themes in the book of Judges. And so one of the first section that you're going to talk about is idolatry. So you might make a topic sentence that says, idolatry is a pervasive idea throughout the book of Judges. That's a good first sentence to have when you're going to talk about idolatry in the book of Judges, because it sets up letting the reader know, oh, what you're going to be arguing is that idolatry is a pervasive idea in the book of Judges. Now, what a bad topic sentence for that would be, the book of Judges is the 6th book in the Old Testament. Well, there's a problem with that for 2 reasons. One, because it's not the 6th book in the Old Testament. It's actually the 7th book in the Old Testament. But another problem with that would be, let's just say the number was right. The other problem with that would be, what you're supposed to argue then for the rest of the paragraph is the order of the book of Judges within the entire Old Testament. And you're not arguing that. That's not the point that you're trying to make. So make sure that that topic sentence really focuses on the main points that you're trying to make in the paragraph that you're working on at that moment. The next thing that I want to say is stay on topic. This is crucial. Almost no students are able to do this because they find something that they want to include and they put it in there anyway. But what that really shows is that you don't understand the subject. If you're putting in extra material that is off topic, it's really showing that you don't understand the main points of the argument and that you're unclear on what you should be writing. So that's the only thing that the professor who's grading your paper that they can assume. So there's always more to say in a paper. I know you want to include every bit of information that you had. No, that's not good. Imagine if your pastor did that. They would never get done preaching. They would preach for hours on end, 2, 3, 4 hours if they revealed to you or said to you everything that they had. But you cannot say everything. You just can't. So just hit on the content that is absolutely necessary to make your argument. So if I am talking about, again, idolatry in the book of Judges, what I'm going to do is I'm going to pick 3 or 4 really good points that I can make about what idolatry is in the book of Judges and how it shows that it's pervasive throughout the book. I'm not going to try to pick every single thing within the book and find and another thing that I'm not going to do is I'm not going to just summarize the entirety of the book of Judges. More on that in just a second. So also remember that you're arguing towards a point and you're trying to prove your thesis. So imagine that I gave you a paper where you were supposed to tell me, how the movie Braveheart portrays the concept of freedom. Many of us have probably seen the movie Braveheart. And we've probably thought about how the movie, portrays freedom. It's a central theme within the movie. If I asked you to do that, I know by experience that the majority of students would basically just summarize the movie Braveheart. And at times, they would hit on the concept of freedom as it is found throughout the movie, but really what their paper would be is a summary of the movie Braveheart. That is not a good paper. That's actually a very poor paper. That's, at best, a C-level paper. Well, why? Well, it's that way because the paper isn't about summarizing the movie Braveheart. And if you summarize the movie, you've probably included everything in the movie, all of the main plot twists. You've talked about all of the characters. You've talked about who the characters are. And that's not the point of the paper. I don't need to know that. I assume that the reader already knows that, or you should assume that the reader already knows that, because the point of the paper is to talk about the concept of freedom. So really all that you would do in that paper, you wouldn't talk about the movie, you wouldn't talk about the producers of the movie, you wouldn't even really at length talk about the characters in the movie. The main points that you would make would concern the concept of freedom. And so you'd pick 3 or 4 really good aspects of the movie or scenes within the movie maybe where freedom is portrayed, and you'd talk about what those scenes say about freedom. So it's the same thing. If you're looking at themes in the book of Judges or something along those lines, you're not going to summarize the entire book of Judges. If you do that, it lets me know that you don't know what the themes of the book of Judges are. I don't say that to sound mean. But really, it shows me that you aren't able to discern what the main themes are. So instead, what you had to do was you had to summarize the entirety of the book. So it's really important that you stay on topic and that you're arguing towards that point in your thesis. With that being said, every good paper on the next slide has research and uses references. We don't do biblical interpretation on our own, right? We always do it in a community, and there have been 2,000 plus years of faithful interpreters of the Word of God. For an undergraduate or graduate level paper, you need to use academic sources. So what do I mean by this? And so I'm going to kind of unfold how you can use academic sources, the different kinds of academic sources. But before I do that, I want to make a couple of points. The first one is that good research takes a long time. The purpose of research is not so that you can find a pithy quote. It's not so that you can just find this really sparkling gem of words that are strung together that sound really good in your paper from someone else. The main point of research is so that you can go through someone else's arguments about the same topic or a similar topic to what you're looking at, and you can learn from them. And then from what you learn from them, you can better shape and mold and craft your own ideas, and you can have a better understanding of it. It's not so that you can just find quotes or get these little nuggets of information from them. It's so that you can be further immersed in their ideas. So you'll find that there are a lot of resources. So good research takes a long time. You're going to find that there are a lot of resources, but you will only use a small amount of those resources. So when you're writing a paper, let's just say you've got 10 resources, you're probably going to comb through initially probably about 100 or 200 resources. I'm not saying you're going to read everything, but you're going to look at the titles of them, right? And you're going to kind of weed some out. But after you've kind of done some initial weeding, right, you're going to be able to more thoroughly engage this thing. So kind of what I recommend is that you find resources through a process. You can find a recent thorough treatment on the topic. Scan the bibliography. So if you're writing on idolatry in the book of Judges, maybe find a recent commentary on the book of Judges or a monograph or something that's been written on the book of Judges recently, and scan the bibliography of that. Look and see if you can find any good resources in that bibliography. I'll talk about also how to use the library and different things like that later. Gather resources that you have found and find sources via other means that I'm going to discuss below. Then, once you've found your resources, once you've gathered them together, skim them. Right. So once you've found a good amount, you've ruled some out by their titles, you know that it's not gonna work. Scan them. Just kind of look at them. Scan over them with your eyes. It'll take you about a minute for each one of them. So let's just say that you've got 30 resources that you're looking at. It's going to take you 30 minutes to scan over those. And in that 30 minutes, what you're going to do is you're going to probably be able to rule that down to about 15, right? And then after you've ruled it down to 15, read the abstract. The abstract is basically the summary of what the entire article is about. And most libraries provide for you an abstract, or the article itself or the book itself will provide for you an abstract of what you're looking for. After you've done that, you've probably ruled it down to somewhere between 7 and 10. Read the whole argument. Read the whole source. If it's a book, maybe you just read the chapters that are going to be particularly helpful. But you're going to read the whole source. Because again, remember, research is not about finding pithy quotes. It's about interacting with ideas. But you may be thinking at this point in time, well, this takes a really long time to do. Yes, it does. It really does take a long time to do. But this is what the writing process looks like. This is what everyone who's ever written a good paper has to go through. As a general rule, and by general rule, really in my classes, I mean this is an ironclad rule. I never want to see you use .com, .net, .org, really even .edu websites. Now, with that said, I'm not saying that you cannot use the internet to do research. I use the internet all the time to do research. But there's a difference between using the internet to do research and then using a .com, .net, .org, or even a .edu website as a resource. So I can find scholarly things like books and journal articles and different things like that online. So I'm using the internet to find them, but I'm not using, theologyblog.com. I don't know if that's an actual blog. I just kind of came up with that just now. But theologyblog.com as a way of interacting with an issue. And the reason for that is because it's not a trustworthy, it's not a reliable source. And if you're writing an academic paper, you want to interact with the best minds on this. You don't want to interact with somebody, who's probably sitting in their PJs at home, who's, given about 10 minutes of thought to something and decided that they were going to make a blog post on it. I know that that's not how all blogs work, and I know that there are a lot of really good, very helpful websites out there that do say good things at times. But when that happens, to be honest with you, at every website that I know that says something good, there's also a book or an article in print that says something better for it. So do better research. You're in an academic program where there's a higher standard. With that being said, good resources can be found in the online university library. Our university library has amazing resources. I know that you may think that it doesn't. You may have even been told by professors that it doesn't. This is not true. I do the vast majority of my research through the university library, and it has absolutely amazing resources. Really, it's just about learning how to research on the university library. And once you go to the library, really what you want to do is you want to find ATLA and you want to log in there. And then you want to do broad searches, right? Like Abraham, if you're writing on Abraham, or David, if you're writing on David. Then you might do a little bit more generic searches. Like if you're looking for a biblical passage, you might, let's just say that you're writing a paper on Judges chapter 8. On Judges chapter 8, if I was doing a paper on that, I would do a search on Gideon. The reason why I would do a search on Gideon is because, well, Gideon is the main character in that particular chapter. I would also do a search on Judges 8. Then I would do a search on JUDG 8, because sometimes titles and articles, they will summarize, or they'll abbreviate the title for the book of Judges. And so if you just type in Judges 8, you might not get the exact same resource hits that you would do as you get Judge 8. One thing to be particularly careful with when you're doing searches is all libraries are like this, but you can't search like you do on Google where you just throw a string of words together. You're never going to get any hits. So what you have to do is you have to use like the Boolean phrases, or you have to do the search as it's intended to. In ATLA, you'll see the word and then you'll see a new search bar. So if you're looking for Judges 8, you can put those two next to each other. But if you're looking for something else, like if you want to search, all right, well, I want to search Judges 8, or I want to search Gideon, and I want to search the idea of monarchy. I'm not just going to put Gideon monarchy right next to each other. You won't get any hits. But if you put Gideon on one line and then monarchy on the next line, you'll get significantly more hits. On the next page, I continue on with discussion of research and references. Published books are generally good sources. They're not always good sources. With that said, not all books are created equal. For biblical studies, there are good publishers. Broadman and Holman, or B&H, Crossway, Zondervan, Thomas Nelson, Baker, Erdmans, Kriegel, those kinds of publishers. They're all very well respected publishers. And then there's obviously more advanced publishers as you get into upper level undergraduate and graduate level work. JSOT, Almond, Oxford, Cambridge, Brill, SBL, Van Gorkum. There are several. There are a lot more than the ones that I've listed here. But generally, right, published works are good works. With that being said, I'm going to talk about here in just a minute how there are some works that you want to stay away from. Solid academic papers will use academic journals as sources. This should really be, in any paper that you write, the primary go-to source that you use when you're writing papers. And I mention this for a couple of reasons. One, they're usually more in-depth. So if you're looking at a topic, an academic journal or a journal article in a journal is going to have more thorough treatment of the topic that you're going to be looking at. That's not always the case, but generally, as a rule, it is true. Another thing is that academic journals are usually more recent. Not that more recent scholarship is always better, but it usually takes into account the ideas of others that have been published in more recent times, which is always a helpful thing. So these can be found most easily in the university library. They are the most up-to-date and reliable. There are a fair amount of academic journals that are of very high quality that are free and open source online. So for Old Testament studies, there's jesot.org. There's also jhsonline.org. There's Themelios, which is the journal of the Gospel Coalition. It's an academic journal. So there are a fair amount of free open source academic journals online. Now, there are some things that pass themselves off as academic journals that aren't online as well. So you do want to be discerning on that. But if you ever have a question, if you ever have a doubt on that, just ask me. I'm always here to help. And with that, I mentioned earlier that published books are generally good sources. You need to stay away from popular self-help type books. So for instance, I really enjoy reading people like John MacArthur or even John Piper or people along those lines. But they're not really writing in an academic fashion when they're writing devotionally. And that's great. And I love reading devotional type works, but that's not what you're doing in this class. You also want to stay away from like commentaries that are devotional in nature, like Charles Spurgeon's, Morning and Evening, or Matthew Henry's commentary on the whole Bible. I like reading Matthew Henry, but Matthew Henry's purpose is not to exegete the text. His purpose is not to give a thorough reading of the text either. His purpose is really to help you with your devotional thoughts on the text. And that's admirable, and that's great, but that's not really what you're doing. That's not really what you're doing when you're trying to write an academic paper. There are better resources out there. So what I'm really looking for is for you to find the best sources. Don't settle for okay sources. There are a lot of sources that are okay, but your papers will stand out if they find the best sources for an academic paper. So what I'm saying here is I can tell who understands the topic largely and by what sources they're using. So if you're using bad sources, it says to me that you didn't really understand the topic. I understand that there's a learning curve in here, right? But if you understand what you're talking about, so imagine something that you know really well, right? I don't know a whole lot about a lot of things, but I know a lot about the sport tennis. And I can tell whether somebody knows about tennis by the way that they talk about it. I can tell somebody who kind of has a general idea of, all right, the professional concept of tennis, some of the major professional players, so they've heard about tennis, they've engaged with people in conversations. But I know basically every rule about tennis. I'm sure that there are some that I don't, but I have played tennis competitively for a very long time, and I know the rules of tennis, even the crazy obscure ones. And so I can tell whether somebody knows about tennis and the detail that they know about tennis by how they talk about how they play, how they talk about different shots, how they talk about their rating level, how they talk about the other people or who they reference when they're talking about who knows about tennis, or the kind of or different things like that. So what the sources of knowledge that they're appealing to there, I can tell whether they know about it. Well, and it's the same way within biblical studies. That's actually the topic that I know the best. I can tell whether you understand something kind of by who you're using and by who you're referencing when you're looking at topics. Another thing that I want to say is stay away from book reviews. As you go into the online university library, you're going to see that there are a lot of things that are book reviews. Book reviews are fine if you're trying to just understand what a book is about and whether that book is worth your time, worth picking up and reading. But what you need to do is you need to stay away from book reviews within your paper. You can read them to try to understand whether a book would be helpful, but do not cite them. This is just a review of a book by someone else. Don't do that. With that being said, there are some good places that you can look after you've looked in the university library. Google Books. If you go to Google, and if you have a Gmail account or a YouTube account or anything like that, then you're probably pretty familiar with Google. You've probably used Google a lot. In Google's apps, so if you click on that little grid up at the top of the screen, and you scroll down just a little bit, you look down into more of the apps. Google has a feature called Google Books. Google Books will often publish, or will often have on there, full texts of books, and you're interacting with the book there. You're not using Google at that point, you're using the book. You're just using Google to find the book. They will also have what are known as limited previews. Sometimes in a limited preview, you'll really have about 90% of the book at your hands. So again, you're interacting with the book at that point. You've even got page numbers for the book. So Google Books is a great resource. Google Scholar is also helpful. You could also use Google, but you need to be very careful here. I would very much recommend staying away from that. I do that kind of as a last resort after I've done everything else and all the rest of my research. Amazon Limited Preview has a very similar feature to what Google Books does, where you can read usually about the first chapter of a book with an Amazon Limited Preview. So if you go to Amazon's website and you're there, you can usually click on most of the resources, and as you're clicking on most of the resources, when you're doing that, it will allow you to read the first chapter or so of most, not all, books. Another good resource to use is academia.edu. Academia.edu is kind of like it's a social media site for geeks, and so a lot of scholars post their articles and at times chapters from books that they've written on academia.edu as a free open source way of different people having access to their writing. It's really an amazing tool to use. Another place that I would recommend is biblicalstudies.org.uk. And on this, basically this is just someone who has gathered together a significant amount of scholarly sources. Again, you're not interacting with biblicalstudies.org.uk. What you're interacting with is the articles or the books that have been published or posted there. And those are generally, not always, but generally very good sources. So on the next slide, I'm going to mention some things to remember. Please remember this. I'm telling you what I prefer. Every professor has their own preferences, so always check with your professor. The next thing that I want to point out is that every discipline structures and argues papers in a different way. Hence, most departments use different styles. So APA, Turabian, Chicago, MLA, etc. Right? So make sure that you're familiar and that you are thoroughly acquainted with the style that your papers are supposed to be in. They're in that style for a reason, because that's the best way to communicate your material or your subject matter. You should always try to be faithful, not creative. We're in biblical studies here. And in biblical studies and in theology classes, it's not our job to come up with new stuff. It's our job to be faithful with the biblical text. We want to make sure that we are good and faithful stewards of God's word. That's the important thing. I found that creativity often does not inspire faithfulness. It often inspires really a wandering away from the faith. So just be mindful and be cognizant of that fact. So I'm going to move on just for a quick time here, and on the next slide, talk about grammar and style. So use the style, as I mentioned, that you're using for your papers, the recommended style. And with the grammar and style, use Times New Roman 12-point font and doublespace. Every style requires that. So every style requires that. Don't use a different type of font. Even if when you open your word processing program, probably Microsoft Word, it opens up in Calibri now. I know that. Don't write it in Calibri. Write it in Times New Roman 12-point font. Put your name on your paper. This is actually part of the style for every style. but I would say a third of my students never put their name on their assignments. Use in-text citations and have a reference page in the appropriate style. And so in-text citations, some of you who are reading this will have to use APA. Some of you who are listening to this will have to use Turabian. Both of those have in-text citations. And what I mean by in-text citations is if you're using APA, MLA, or Turabian, you're going to cite something in the body of the paper, and then you're going to cite it in the reference page or the bibliography. So it is important that you understand that there are some differences between those things. So if you don't cite it in the body of the paper, but do cite it in the reference page, you've plagiarized. You've technically plagiarized. You need to cite it in both places. So in Turabian, you use footnotes to do in-text citations. In APA style, you use parentheses. You use parenthetical notations in the body of the paper. Avoid using first person unless it is a personal reflection paper, which I have very rarely in my classes, so you're almost never going to use this. So don't use I, me, my, we, us, our. Another thing that you need to do is avoid using second person. It would be a very rare thing indeed that you would ever use second person in an academic paper. So just stay away from second person, which is you and yours. And your. So avoid that. On the next slide, I continue talking about grammar and style. Avoid contractions. There's only one more button that you have to click between don't and do not. In academic papers, you should, by style. Every style requires that you avoid contractions. Don't make overstatements. So when you're trying to make a point, don't say clearly, always, never, right? Avoid those kinds of statements. Just make the statement that the book of Judges talks about idolatry pervasively, right? Because I'm going to prove the word pervasively, right? Don't say, any fool would see that the book of Judges talks about idolatry. Well, there's always going to be somebody out there who you're going to have to convince, and you don't want to start off the argument by saying that they're a fool. It's just not a good way to start off the argument. And again, clearly kind of gives that same feeling to it. So I have an academic paper that I have published. It was published by a respectable journal, and I used the word clearly like 4 times in it. And I regret that I did that. I look at that and I'm just like, oh, I could have written that so much better. So don't do that. Another thing that I'm going to say is front load all of your arguments. Many of you are used to writing for maybe an English class where you unfold a story. That's beautiful in creative writing. It's terrible in writing a paper for an academic discipline, particularly within the biblical and theological studies. You don't want to do that at all. In fact, you're going to kind of show your hand. You're not developing an argument, and then at the end you're saying, this is what I was arguing all along. I hope that you saw it, even though I kind of gave you no hint of it, because then that person's going to have to reread your argument to see if you actually accomplished it. Really what you should do is through your thesis statement and through your topic sentences is you want to front load that argument. So you're making the statement, the topic of idolatry or idolatry is pervasive throughout the book of Judges. And then I'm going to show how that's happening. I'm just going to make my statement, and then I'm going to prove that statement. So whenever you make a statement, you need to prove everything that you say. You can't take anything for granted. You need to prove it. If you make a statement, don't just leave it hanging in the air. You need to talk about or reference biblical texts that support the idea that you are giving. You also want to be concise yet thorough. I know that may seem like an oxymoronic statement or phrase. It's not. You want to be to the point. You want to say everything that you need to say to prove your argument, and then you want to leave it alone. Don't add more to it after you've said everything that you needed to say. Don't make that secondary argument. The same thing that I said earlier when I was talking about staying on topic. All of these things will lead you to writing a better paper.